Alright guys, this is chapter 5, the Problem of Empire, 1763 to 1776. You see your key terms here. We're also going to be doing a chart. I think this chart is going to make it easier for you guys to identify the different acts that Britain passed right leading up to the American Revolution and the purpose. If you recall, we've seen this map a couple times. So after Britain defeated the French in the French and Indian War, new officials wanted to attempt to prevent colonists from moving westward. Everything in green here is now controlled by Britain, and everything in pink here is controlled by Spain. So this is called the Western Frontier. After the British defeated the French, notice the amount of troops that were in the Americas, which is right around here, so about 8,500 more or less. And Britain had more troops in the Americas than any other colonies. Obviously, they had a lot of troops in England because they were protecting the homeland, and Ireland as well because that was part of the British Empire eventually. So in Americas, they had a lot of troops. In order for them to be able to pay those troops, something needed to be done. After the war ended in 1763, more or less, you see a huge increase here in British public debt. So the British monarch needed to find ways to be able to pay for these troops. Recall the proclamation line of 1763 prevented colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. That's the Appalachian Mountains, so you have troops stationed all around here. This is known as the Indian Reserves, where Native Americans were supposed to be there, and these British subjects were prevented from moving westward, and that's where the conflict starts. Because these troops, they needed money, Britain needed money to pay for those troops, Britain started to exert a lot of laws. First, it started with the Sugar Act, and that was just a tax on French molasses, which is a sweeten. It's a type of a sugar. And then also the Navigation Acts, which were now being enforced. Recall the Navigation Acts were actually passed in the 1660s, but not until 1760, about 100 years later, did Britain actually enforce them. So this prevented colonists from shipping and trading with any other countries except Britain. And what that did was, this political cartoon tells us King George, or the King of England I should say, got really rich because the colonists were giving the British a lot of money. This is the end of salutary neglect. This is where, in salutary neglect, England allowed the colonies to govern themselves and run their own colony. So the colonists experienced with some form of self-government and being able to run their own economy. At the end of salutary neglect in the 1760s, England now wanted to assert its full control over the colonies and make sure that the colonies were following English laws and paying taxes and paying for the protection from the British troops. Well, that's where the conflict arises because the colonists did not want to pay for those British troops without representation. So England continues to exert its power. They passed the Stamp Act in 1764. This is taxes on paper goods such as newspapers, birth and death certificates, playing cards, newspapers, court documents, among others. This is the famous Stamp Act that was supposed to be put on every colonial good. That way people knew that they were paying a tax on the stamp. And the colonists responded by rebelling against here. And this is in Boston. They have a bonfire going on here. And that bonfire is full of documents that were supposed to have the stamp. The colonists are showing that they are now rebelling against the British Empire. In addition to that, colonists met in different meetings to repeal and denounce the Stamp Act. Colonists were not against paying taxes per se, but they were against taxation without representation. This is the idea that were brought in by the Enlightenment, the idea of self-government. That is, where people have a say in policies and laws to rule themselves. Eventually, England realized that the Stamp Act was actually creating more conflict than what it was doing, than what it was helping. So we have here a political cartoon that shows this man carrying the Stamp Act inside a small little coffin to be buried somewhere else. So it shows the strength of the colonists, and it shows that the colonists are no longer going to be taking British law just because they say that they need to follow it. Not only that, what happens is all these goods that are being brought from England, they're very expensive. So we have individual groups, we have women, we have political activists, laborers, artisans that declare boycotts on all British goods. So in this particular case, the Daughters of Liberty, which was a group of women who boycotted British goods, instead of buying manufactured British clothing, they went ahead and produced their own clothing. They yarn their own clothing, they dye their own clothing, and so this was stimulating the economy for the colonies, and it was hurting the British Empire. And as such, the British eventually got rid of some of these rules, some of these laws. But they wanted to show the colonies that Britain was still in control. So Britain eventually passes the Quartering Act in 1765, which required colonial governments to provide housing and food for British goods. If Britain it cannot collect enough money to be able to provide for the British goods themselves, then the colonies needed to do their part and house and provide food for these British goods. Here's a simple political cartoon that kind of shows that. So these are the colonies, they have their own homes. The British are coming in, they're asking for quartering, they're asking for housing, and naturally food as well. Well, that doesn't go all that good either, but Britain continues to exert its control. So they passed the Declaratory Act in 1766, which reassured Parliament. Parliament is the people in England that have the power to make laws, that they have the power to enact laws and statutes over the colonies. Then the Thousand Act is passed in 1767, which taxed paper, paint, glass, and tea on the colonies. Again, the colonists responded with some form of social unrest. So the colonists began to protest. They burned effigies of people in the colonies that are collecting these taxes and the king. This talks about the folly or the ignorance of England and the taxes that they're putting. So all these taxes are being collected, again, to provide for the British soldiers, to provide for the protection of the colonies, according to Britain. Eventually, it leads to a very important event, which becomes known as the Boston Massacre. So what you see here is British troops that are there to protect the tax collectors who were loyal to the King of England. These are the colonists who are protesting these taxes. So on the night of March 5th, 1770, colonists and British troops, they collide. These colonists begin to protest and throw rocks and throw stones at the British. The British eventually open fire and kill 5 colonists. And that sends a ripple effects across all the colonies. Even though this took place in Boston, it could happen in any other colony. And so it actually unites the colony against the British. The following day, the Boston newspaper posts this newspaper that shows the people that got killed. Notice one of them is Crispus Attucks. He's an African American, the first African American to die for independence. The years go by and people do not forget the Boston Massacre. We'll come back to that. England is still trying to exert its control over the colonies, so they passed another law called the Tea Act in 1773. This law taxed tea, and even though at this point with this law, British tea was actually cheapest than any other tea, like French tea or Dutch tea, it was a symbol of British dominance because Britain was still enforcing these acts without the consent of the colonies. So the colonists respond with more social unrest. They dressed up as Native Americans on the night of December 16, 1773, and they dump the tea over in the Boston port that Britain was supposed to unload. Now, other colonies also prevented these ships from unloading the tea, but only in Boston that the colonists actually took the offensive, climb aboard these ships, and dump that tea over, costing millions and millions of pounds of money for the British Empire. This is a scene from inside the dock or inside the boat. You see Native Americans dumping this tea overboard. And again, another one from the Library of Congress that shows 3 ships that are being taken over by the colonies and dumping the tea over. Now, the conflict didn't stop there, but definitely it was brewing really, really close to war. In the colonies, we have people who are still loyal to Britain, and they're called loyalists. And there's also tax collectors in the colonies. And these tax collectors are harassed by the patriots. The patriots are people who are against British rule and British Empire. And these patriots go around gathering us these tax collectors, tarring and feathering them. In this political cartoon, you see they're actually pouring tea down this tax collector's throat. And you see a little bit more of the Boston Tea Party going on down here. The tree says the Tree of Liberty, and it talks about the Boston Tea Act. And you also see a snooze here that was a symbol that any person in the colonies who was a tax collector and loyal to Britain could be hung at any time. So while all this is going on, there's a lot of social unrest in the colonies. Finally, the 12 colonies meet in what becomes known as the First Continental Congress in 1774, September 1774. They meet to discuss what's going to happen with all these policies, what's going to happen if the situation worsens before it gets better. So as this is going on, Britain amasses a huge army and they ship it over to the colonies. A lot of these troops actually end up in Boston because they want to show those Boston rebels, those people who dumped the tea over, that Britain is still in control. Meanwhile, the colonists also begin to amass a small little army, which becomes known as the Continental Army. And a lot of these people are actually volunteers who, at any minute, are supposed to drop whatever they're doing and attack the British or defend themselves against the British. They become known as the Minutemen. You see the American patriots here and the British troops here. They're in a collision for war, and that's exactly what happens. See, on September 1774, Congress said that they were going to give Britain 6 months to back off on these colonies, on these policies. Well, when the Minutemen assemble, the British hear that the Minutemen have a warehouse full of weapons. So from Boston, they start marching to all these little towns to try to capture these weapons from the colonists. And eventually the two armies meet at Concord on April 18, 1775. The first shots are fired, giving the beginnings to the American Revolution. This was a month before the Second Continental Congress was supposed to meet. So the Second Continental Congress meets on May 1775. This is called Independence Hall, and you would realize why it was called Independence Hall. So Congress meets again in Philadelphia, and they still want to keep their loyalty to England. Some of them do, at least. So some of the representatives in the Second Continental Congress, they actually suggest an olive branch petition. And the tree olive is a symbol of peace, and a branch is an extension of that peace. So some of these congressmen asked Parliament to not only repeal the taxes, but to also collaborate in politics and the economy. When this petition reaches King George III, he refuses it, and he sends more troops to the colonies. Now we have a huge army coming and descending upon the colonies. Despite all this, the population in the colonies, about a third of them are patriots, a third of them are loyalists, people who are loyal to Britain, and a third of them are neutral depending on their religion, their colonies, and their beliefs of what Britain can do. So, despite British military superiority and a third of the colonies being loyal to Britain, the patriot cause gains momentum because of Britain's oppressive laws, British troops stationed in the colonies, and because of this man, Thomas Paine, who writes Common Sense. He was from Britain, migrated to the colonies, and he started to push the balance in favor of independence and in favor of the patriots. In Common Sense, he said that colonies do not need Britain, but rather Britain needs the colonies. This is a spirit of independence, a spirit that derives from the Enlightenment. So patriots and Minutemen began to believe that they could defeat the British and that they have the right to self-government and natural rights, rights given to birth to everybody. And as such, conflict arises even more. So we see here, this is Boston, and the British troops are marching all around these small towns looking for the armory that the colonists are hiding. This is the Tree of Liberty where they eventually hang some of the people. So finally, on May 1775, the Second Continental Congress, they elect George Washington as the leader of the Continental Army, and now there's no turning back. This is going to be a war for independence or a war for oppression. And since it is called Independence Hall, we have Thomas Jefferson from Virginia appointed to write a declaration explaining why the colonies formally want to break away from British rule. And he does exactly that, and that's what the $2 bill shows here on the back. So the Declaration of Independence, first of all, vilifies King George III. Jefferson declares that all men are created equal, and that all men are born with unalienable rights from birth, which are life, liberty, and property. And this document, in the Declaration of Independence, is what eventually leads to the American Revolution.